So yeah, the talk was called "Why Doesn't CSS Have Scope?" And I'm not I'm not sure whether the organizers of CSS Day knew what I was going to be talking about exactly, but they knew me well enough to know that it would probably be slightly irreverent and silly and not containing a great deal of useful information. So good luck everyone with that. I'll move on and get started. Yeah, that's me at CSS Day there. You can see that I've actually got a shaved head there. My hair grows very quickly, hence my hair is now kind of like a longer mess, even though that wasn't very long ago. And so I discovered that you can draw stickmen, or you can draw whatever you like in the slides.com app, or slid.es or whatever it's called. So the premise is that everyone is always coming up to me as someone who is sort of, I suppose, associated in some ways with CSS, because I've written a lot about CSS and things like that. And there's a certain type of person who wants to pick apart CSS and complain that it doesn't have features or it doesn't have characteristics that they'd like. And so they're always coming up to me, and they will accost me in the street. So I'll just be going about my day and they'll come up to me and start shouting at me. Or they'll break into my house and they'll leave angry scrawled post-it notes on my fridge. I don't have a designer Smeg fridge. I just like the word Smeg, so that's how I chose to illustrate it. And also they will telephone me whilst using the toilet. So you really get an idea of the kind of people that you're dealing with here, the kind of sick minds that are involved. This slide did not get a laugh, I don't think, on CSS Day. I think it's like, it took me ages to draw, so I was really disappointed. And I thought like the arch of the back and everything was really good there. I actually traced a photograph of a toilet to make it look realistic too. But there you go, you win some and you lose some. But yeah, the question that they're always asking me is, why doesn't CSS have scope? The title of this talk. And the way I reply is by saying this. I say that CSS does have scope. CSS is fundamentally a scoping mechanism. CSS was invented to apportion scope. You cannot write CSS without setting scope. CSS without scope is a syntactically invalid bunch of pointless Unicode characters, all of which is true. I think what they're thinking, what's in their mind, is how JavaScript has scope. And JavaScript has different kinds of scope. It has block scope, it has local scope, it has function scope, and the much maligned global scope. And I think it's kind of funny how so much of the way that we create things, especially with JavaScript, is moving into trying to modularize and compartmentalize and componentize, that's not a real word, the bits of code that we're doing. And the dreaded thing is, if things leaked into the global scope, then that would be a problem, like variables and things like that. And it can be a problem, but there's also a movement to bring back global scope in terms of application logic. So things like Redux and Vuex are all about sharing state across all of these different components, actually making them aware of a shared global thing. So there's this kind of weird back and forth there. But in terms of CSS, this is how scope works. So this is kind of like block scope in JavaScript, in that you are, or perhaps it's a bit like function scope. If you think of the selector as being like the function name, and then the body of the function is the font family side. But the point is that you are scoping this style, this font family style, to a paragraph. And a little bit of meta commentary about the talk again here is that for each of these slides, I've deliberately written code which doesn't work, because I guess I'm surrounded by people who are very, very clever and very knowledgeable about modern CSS. So we have people who are DevRels from Google and that kind of thing at CSS Day, and I just wanted to make myself kind of the fool who doesn't know how CSS works. But I also wanted to kind of say, you're not getting free CSS from me, which actually works. I'm not here just to give you not that you wouldn't know how font family works, but yeah, so that I made a point of making all of my code broken, which I accept is kind of a counterintuitive way to approach doing a technical talk at a high profile conference, but there you go. But yeah, the scoping part there is correct, and this is how scope works. And equally, you can have more specific scope. So in this case, you're scoping the style to the paragraph, but only the paragraph if it's inside an aside. This is like the fundamental way that CSS works. And now with modern CSS, you can do things which are ludicrously complicated like this, not that you would often do it. So you can say, make sure that this is scoped to paragraphs that directly follow paragraphs that are children of a size that do not belong to the sidebar class, but do include a descendant H2 heading. And as you can see, again, the code is completely broken and useless because it has the wrong value. And of course, you do have global scope in CSS. But the irony, I suppose, is that everyone accuses CSS of always having global scope. They don't frame what they mean by that. We'll get into that in a minute. But the point is that you actually have to be very specific if you want a style to have global scope. You have to use this one specific character on its own. Otherwise, it's not global scope. So CSS kind of scopes things by default. You have to deliberately choose a specific pattern to make it not. And of course, they'll say, when I explain all of this to them, these people who are demanding scope in CSS, that, okay, I accept this is scope, you've got me there, but that's not scope like JavaScript. And the thing is, the reason for that is that JavaScript and CSS are different things for different ends. It seems like an obvious thing to point out, but the way that scoping works in CSS is bound to be different than the way it works in JavaScript, simply because they are entirely different languages which are designed for doing entirely different things, one behavior, the other style or appearance. In JavaScript, if you tried to scope things and it didn't work, if you didn't have scoping in JavaScript in this way, then it would be a bit of a disaster, because if your function scope didn't work as it should here, when you redeclare a const inside another function, it would affect the const inside the previous function, and then that just like nothing would work. But that's not really the same. You don't have the same kind of concerns in CSS, because in CSS, what you're trying to do first off is you're trying to make everything as consistent as possible. It makes sense to have the default be that these local or these scope styles are applying globally, as in it's not just applying to one paragraph, but it's applying to all instances of a paragraph. Because your components, you're really, unless you're deliberately trying to make a hideous interface, you're not going to want to have a different paragraph style in each case. You're going to want them to all look the same, and CSS is designed to do that. The purpose of a function should be unique in JavaScript, and that's kind of really what a function is in JavaScript. It's just a way to define a single unique action or purpose, so that it can be reused. But the appearance of paragraphs should not be unique. And just to give you some sort of precedents for that, I've just picked at random 3 books where paragraphs are all styled the same way. The first book is this book, The Guy Who Sold Us Mushrooms Won't Stop Talking. The second book, The Holy Bible, by, I thought God, but it says it's by giant print here at the bottom. And The Power to Pish It by Brad Pissell. If you look inside any of these books, you'll see that the paragraphs are pretty consistent in their appearance. You can see in Genesis, in the Bible, the first paragraph and let's say the 4th paragraph have the same line height, they have the same font, the same letter spacing, same word spacing, those kinds of things, same typographic characteristics. But sometimes you will want there to be an exception, especially in an interface, perhaps some less important text or some or a sort of an aside, or we have a small element in HTML. Maybe that text might want to be a little bit smaller. So what you do is you take this approach with CSS, and I think Harry Roberts characterized it this way as an inverted triangle. You use the fewest number of selectors as possible to begin with, and very non-specific selectors to do most of the work. And that's a really important principle in CSS that I think a lot of people who are engaged in CSS today, especially people who are sort of influenced by this modularization culture, which we're taking from JavaScript, don't really understand or appreciate how powerful that is, I think, which is why I'm passionate about talking about it. But yes, you use things like global and element selectors to do most of the work because most of it wants to be consistent. And then you just build in exceptions. And the exceptions should be exceptions. And if you take that triangle and turn it upside down, you get something where you're treating exceptions as the default or the starting place, then you're going to be writing an awful lot more code. So it's going to be harder to maintain, because if you just wanted to change your paragraph style, you could do it in one place in CSS. But if you were changing paragraph styles across loads and loads of different modularized scoped components with using CSS modules, then you've got a lot of updates to do, which you want to avoid. So with CSS, you really want to leverage this thing where you're styling lots of things simultaneously. And there's only really two ways of doing that. That is just this code in the case of paragraphs. And I appreciate it's kind of a very prosaic example, but that would be how to do it. Or you can do this, you can create a class and then you can apply that class to every paragraph. And this is what we call utility first CSS, I suppose. I'm not a big fan of utility first CSS, and I'm hoping that this slide will show you why that should be obvious. I have, however, written a romance novel about utility first CSS. I've not written the entire novel. I've written a sample chapter, and I'm looking for publishers at the moment. But basically, yeah, it's very erotic, as you might imagine. Yeah, and it's called The Wind Beneath His Tail. And that's my pseudonym there is Heydon Pickering. So to recap what I've said so far, CSS is good for applying consistent style with a minimum of effort and a minimum of code. And what it's bad for is applying inconsistent style for some reason, and you're paid by the hour. Now, I have a kind of I'm a bit ambivalent about this whole thing where we're sort of overcomplicating our industry in terms of our tooling and everything, because my instinct is to just want to do simple things and get them done. But simultaneously, I think there's a lot to be said for creating busy work, because then it's really the only way, given the pressure to have smaller teams, it's really the only way to keep as many people as possible employed and actually working on things. So massive, overcomplicated, over-engineered ecosystems like React, actually, they could be a good thing from that perspective, because it's keeping more people in work so that they can pay for things and they can live their lives. But in any case, the reason that things tend to veer towards embracing inconsistency is just because at an organizational level, and it always comes back to the organization, at an organizational level, we work for people who are highly dysfunctional and don't appreciate or understand the work that we're actually doing, because they're blinkered and obsessed with profit and capital, I suppose. Anyway, so Manuel, a little while ago on Mastodon, asked this question, which was very brave of them to do, I think, given it's on social media. But Manuel asked, what are events in CSS history that changed the way you write CSS? And I have censored the reply, and I'm only going to reveal parts of it to you one at a time, because if you were to read it all at once, then it's possible that you may go into a permanent catatonic state, because it's that mind-bending. Anyway, So the first thing that they say is getting selectors was probably the biggest change I remember. And I read that several times and I found myself wondering, how would CSS even work theoretically without selectors? Because the selector is the thing that you're using instead of applying the style directly to the element. A selector is really just assigning the style. If you're not assigning the style, what are you doing? So I'm a bit curious that they remembered that a CSS without selectors. And so I kind of looked into this. I looked up Cascading Style Sheets Level 1, which was published in 1995. I was about 13 then, I think. And I noticed that among the basic concepts are listed various things like inheritance, which we'll get onto in a bit, but also class as a selector and ID as a selector. And they're only just picking those out. There's obviously element selectors as well as standard. But then I looked back even further to the first original proposal for CSS where, and I hadn't actually seen this until I researched this talk. I've not actually looked at it directly. And it's a bit like looking into the sun, but they have selector, a kind of a selector. It's an entirely different syntax, but these are kind of selectors. And it's actually really interesting too, because the idea is that you kind of set the styles at the document level so they'd apply to everything that way, rather than say using HTML or using root or something. And then you can even kind of use those constants. And this is like a calculation. And it wasn't until much later into CSS proper that we actually got the calc function. So it's kind of weird that that was baked into this original proposal. But in any case, that they are these things here are kind of selectors. So I don't know what this person was talking about. Anyway, so the next part was even more surprising to me. Getting selectors was probably the biggest change I remember, and a huge mistake in my opinion. And I just thought to myself, so the mistake was to make CSS work, essentially, to make CSS. And I appreciate that is a prevalent kind of view of CSS, is that it shouldn't exist. It's not a real programming language. It doesn't do anything properly. Inline styles are fine or whatever. But a bit surprising to find someone actually say that on a public forum in that way. And of course, they said, and it's when we decided that CSS was another global namespace. Not quite sure that passes correctly or makes sense. Like CSS isn't just a global namespace. And if it was, what does it belong to aside from to itself? But in any case, the problem is this scope thing. They wanted to have scope. The really kind of weird, ironic thing for me is that we now have various ways, various technologies, which artificially scope CSS. And by that, what I mean, and I'm not sure I adequately explained this when I actually gave the talk at CSS Day, but what I mean is that we are making it so that basically we don't have to write longer selectors if we want to be more specific and more deliberate in the styles that we're making. So if we have a component, we can use a button selector, and the way that, because we've scoped it in inverted commas, that means that that button selector will only apply to that component. The trouble there, of course, is that we go straight into doing that using tools like styled components, rather than styling generic buttons first and reusing those styles. Or sometimes we do that. You can be smarter than that with styled components, obviously. But the weird thing about it that I was going to get onto is that even within libraries like styled components, which are specifically designed for scoping CSS in that way, there are escape hatches. And in this case, it's create global style. If you use the create global style function, that allows you to simply write CSS. So it will embed a style. It'll embed a style element with CSS in it, which will then apply like CSS from an external style sheet would. So you've got this escape hatch into real CSS again. So from that point of view, there's kind of two ways to approach writing what I would call real CSS. You can just write CSS. You can just use CSS, you can use .css files, you can use embedded CSS, you can use the style element, you can do it that way. Or you can find a homophobe to invent JavaScript, then wait for a sexist, privacy breaching, hot or not app to evolve into a genocide fomenting social media site, which will then, in order to manage its incredibly complex and migraine-inducing interface, invents React. And then someone will then have to come along to create style components, which was then a library for React and for managing styles within React. And then you could use the create global style function, which comes with, I don't know which version, but which comes with styled components. I shouldn't need to say that obviously one of these approaches is a bit more efficient and sort of makes the best use of the platform and the standards available to you. I should say this is another bit of sort of meta commentary. My talks do tend to mention Brendan Eich, who is the inventor of JavaScript. And I make sort of remarks like, JavaScript was written in 10 days and you can tell and stuff like that. I mean, I actually really like JavaScript. I write a lot of JavaScript. I just don't like other people's JavaScript. But the reason I keep bringing up Brendan Eich is because I think it's just worth reminding people that he's a homophobe and he's a COVID denier and various other things. I get a bit of fun out of that. And in fact, on my briefs.video, the website where I put my ridiculous videos, the JavaScript that runs the button, which when you press it, you get goat noises, which is an entirely other conversation. The story of how Brendan Eich really is a homophobe. It's not just an opinion. He actually did donate some money to try and reverse equal marriage in California, I believe. It explains all of that just using variable names. Okay, so back to components and scoping and things. So what will happen is a lot of the time with this scoping thing is that people, what they're worried about is there being a clash between two components. The idea of scoping things is that your, say, button selector that you're writing wouldn't affect someone else's button and apply styles to it. It wouldn't leak those styles across, which is on one level a sort of a legitimate concern, but I also think it speaks to the way that we work in this kind of atomized way where we're not really collaborating enough. You should know that what other people are working on. And when you're working with design systems, there really should only be one button component anyway. So this clash, how do we avoid it? Well, yeah, as I say, not a CSS problem. It's a human beings problem, really. So what I do, because I work in terms of design systems when I do front end, I either consult on design systems or I just generally work within them. So when I want to create a button component, I go through a process, and this is the process that I go through. One, I check to see if anyone else has already made the button component, because as I said, there should only be one in the design system, really. Theoretically, you could have different button components, but you should not proliferate buttons. That's why you have design systems, to make sure that you don't have multiple versions of the same thing. You just end up with an interface which looks like a patchwork quilt designed by Satan. And then once I've checked to see if someone has already made a button component, I take one of two courses. Either if they haven't made a button component, then I will make a button component. But crucially, if they have made a button component, then I make a different component, or I don't make a component at all. And if I do choose to make a different component, what I make sure I do is that I don't call it a button component, because that would be misleading, or I don't use the term button. I will name it after what it does, which is not being a button. The problem, and it is a grave problem with taking this kind of approach, is that talking to people and reading your own design systems documentation, writing that documentation in the first place, using Command plus F and searching for things, and some would say writing CSS itself, because they're very pejorative about CSS not being a real programming language or whatever. These are all what's called soft skills. And unfortunately, there's not really a climate of being able to sell yourself on soft skills. You need to be able to say that you know GraphQL and Redux and things like that, not that you're not a dickhead and you listen and that sort of thing, even though ultimately those are the more important things. What isn't a soft skill is creating random strings. And so instead of taking that approach, and the things listed in my bullet list there, this is how we artificially scope things so that we don't have to worry about our selectors. We post hoc, we convert our selectors into these unique strings. And that is how all of these JavaScript libraries work when doing this. Style Components works that way, WebC works that way, and Vue works that way as well. The problem with these things is that just to scope some styles, and I'm going to say now that there are some times where I kind of want to do that. So in a design systems documentation, you might want to say embed a demo of the component, and you don't want it to share styles with the documentation side itself. That kind of thing. Maybe you want to scope styles that way. So I decided that instead of running create React app and having like 2 megabytes of JavaScript for a hello world just so that I can use style components or whatever it is, I decided to write my own little bit of code that does that scoping. And it is a real thing, despite the fact that it's called CSS Copulation Enterprise Max AI. It does actually work. It's not just a stupid name, despite what people seem to think in my issues stream. It's less than 0.5K, which I believe means that if you gzipped it, it would actually get bigger rather than smaller, which is a bit unfortunate. The threshold for that might be a bit lower actually. But yeah, it's very, very small. And the reason it's small is because what I don't do is take the CSS, turn it into an abstract syntax tree, run through it all, find what are possibly the parts of the selectors that I want to convert, try and detect that, and then replace them with randomized strings. What I do instead is simply tell the user to use a random character, which is this section character. I didn't know what that was, so I had to ask the audience at CSS Day. But it's the weird snaky character, which is on my keyboard. That's the symbol by default. And it simply just looks for that and does a find and replace and adds a data attribute with this scoped. It applies that attribute to the containing element, and then that's it, you're away. So sometimes the less clever way to do things is the better way to do things because it's less code, if you sort of mean. And the great thing about it just being replacing a character or replacing a designated string is that you can replace it with this, which means you can pretend you're writing JavaScript and feel like a real programmer. I have to, for legal reasons, read this out. I have been advised to point out that this ES module does not constitute a true form of artificial intelligence in any way, and that my inclusion of the suffix AI should be treated with the same suspicion and contempt as any other product that conflates artificial intelligence with some kind of trivial code execution. So I'll just get that out of the way. But I think the thing that I want to get at here is that JavaScript, in this case, isn't augmenting CSS in any way. It's not making CSS behave differently. It's just helping us write it, if you sort of mean. The attribute selector part and it matching is all it's doing. It's not some clever internal. It's not some specific API or something, kind of like how Houdini or something works. It's just old CSS, and it's really old CSS. The contextual selector here, which is where we had one earlier, which was a side P, but like one like this. That's been around for since 1996. So since not long after CSS first appeared. So that's some time. And to put that into perspective, that is shortly before Radiohead released OK Computer. It's shortly before The Prodigy released their third album, The Fat of the Land, which, it just brings me back loads of memories of me being a teenager. Before Portishead's Dummy, which is one of my favorite albums, a really extraordinary blend of kind of surf guitar and trip hop or hip hop, and they invented trip hop, I guess. So that's pretty innovative stuff. And of course, before Hanson released their album Middle of Nowhere, featuring the single Mbop. So we had contextual selectors in CSS before Mbop came along, and also before a lot of very confused older men fell in love with the legal-aged woman pictured in the middle there, and of course not a woman and not legal-aged either. And it's before we had the contextual selector, before the release of this album, which has a special place in my heart. I don't know if anyone else here is familiar with it, but it's an album called To Ride, Shoot Straight and Speak the Truth by Entombed, who are a Swedish death metal band, perhaps the most famous or most influential death metal band from that country. And the reason that it reminds me of this album in particular is for this reason. When Entombed released this record, and this still upsets me to this day, and I got this album when it came out, is that there were two types of critics. One set of critics, about 50% of the critics, or the music journalists, said there's nothing new about this album. It's just more basic, boneheaded death metal, because they're a death metal band. But they were, I would say, almost deliberately ignoring the fact that they were doing something actually really quite innovative. They were bringing a kind of production aesthetic from much more lo-fi, much looser and dirtier, kind of like garage rock and sort of cow blues end of things. So they were marrying that kind of culture and that kind of sorry, I'm losing my voice, that feel with death metal, which no one had done before. So it was genuinely really innovative. So it wasn't fair that they were just saying it was more of the same. It made me feel like they didn't really listen to it. But at the same time, another 50% or the rest of the critics were saying this is an unexpected departure and betrays the band's death metal base. They recognized the fact that this band were innovating. They weren't trying to make something polished anymore. They weren't trying to make something sounds dangerous, like the kind of the punkier, garage rockier end of the kind of guitar music spectrum. And this reminds me of CSS. I think this is like CSS, because you have one camp of people who are saying it barely does anything. It's not even programming. I actually had an argument with someone on Twitter a long time ago where they just kept saying CSS doesn't do anything. It's not programming because it doesn't do anything. And I think what they meant was it doesn't do anything in the way that I preconceived programming languages should do something, but it made it sound like they were saying CSS literally has no purpose, like there's no reason for it to exist. But yeah, there you go. This same person actually said that JavaScript isn't a real programming language, but Node is a real programming language. So I thought that was interesting. Then you have the other side. You have people who are saying that CSS is too powerful and it keeps programming things I don't expect. It's applying styles to things that I don't want it to, even though I have literally told it to, because I was the one who wrote the selectors. The difference with CSS compared with the music journalists and the Entombed album is that these are the same people. In fact, the Venn diagram is actually just a circle. So you can actually now scope things in the way that you might like. The support, I think, is getting there for this, but you now have this at scope directive. So to be clear, my my CSS Scopulation Enterprise Max module, little helper thing, that was kind of trying to emulate what we used to have, which was the scoped attribute, which is actually really kind of useful because you would just put this attribute on there and hey presto, you can just write simple selectors and not have to worry about the context so much. And it would just apply those paragraph styles within the enclosing element. So the way it worked is that the first child style, yeah, the scope is implicit from the tree, if you sort of mean. I'm not sure I explained that very well, but yeah. But the point was that was a standard. And if we had that as a standard, if we just had scoped, then we could just write the scoped attribute and be done with it, just like we would write any other CSS. But because that's not the case, we had to find someone who's a COVID denier to invent JavaScript, then wait for the sexist, privacy breaching, hot or not app to turn into Facebook, then get React, then get style components. Now with CSS Scopulation Enterprise Max AITM, I've managed to get around some of this. I've managed to get rid of the Facebook and the React part, which is great. And, that saves you a lot of code and everything, but unfortunately not able to get rid of the unfortunate history, the dark history behind JavaScript there, which is sad. So this briefly is how at scope. This is very new, actually. And I believe Christian, I think it was Christian's article that I read that explained it, maybe. But in any case, it's at scope is I guess you'd call it a directive or something. That's what I would call it. And you tell it which element to scope these styles to. So it's kind of removed. It's not as declarative in that you are assigning this to a selector within CSS rather than putting the attribute in HTML. I think I prefer the declarative way of doing things, but I really like web components. So that's just me. But so then you can use this scope selector here, which means style the element itself, the accordion. So that's kind of handy too. And then you can do this thing where you use to, and this confused the hell out of me to begin with, but you can limit how much the scope applies to. So if inside the accordion you have a .content, you have an element with a content class, what that means is that you can, the scope will not apply anymore inside that. So the A selector here will only apply to the outer element, but not inside this. It's almost like encapsulated like an iframe or something. So we have scope, we can use this more or less today, but although support is, yeah, it's not quite there yet, but yeah, that's all new. The problem is with all of these different ways of doing scope. So these are all, and I talked about this in a little bit more detail in the CSS Day version of this talk. So if you look that up, there is a video of that on YouTube. But so style queries are one way of scoping CSS. So you can use a container query and it works kind of like the scope here, except you don't have this to feature, which is kind of handy. There's declarative shadow DOM. So shadow DOM obviously is a way of, I say obviously, shadow DOM enables you to scope styles as well. So you can use simple selectors that way. Declarative shadow DOM is a way of writing shadow DOM without having to use JavaScript. So that's handy. There are kind of like ergonomic limitations to it, but at least you're not using JavaScript. And then, of course, as we discussed, there's scope. The trouble is all of these things only do, they only stop styles leaking out. They don't stop them necessarily coming in, and that's because of something called inheritance. And just to disambiguate, there are two types of inheritance in software or web development. The first is where HTML elements infer which styles should apply to them automatically, which is actually really useful in a lot of ways. Otherwise, you'd have to, going down the tree, you'd have to keep reapplying, say, font family or something like that. And of course, not all properties are inherited, but a number of them are, mostly typographic sort of ones. Probably, it's not something I think about every day, but if it wasn't there, it would make writing CSS a lot more annoying and a lot more piecemeal, I suppose. In any case, that's one type of inheritance. And the other kind of inheritance is when Money Daddy gives you to use a seed capital for your startup, which you hire a number of people more skilled than you and then claim all the credit and all the profits. That kind of inheritance is a lot more popular among software developers than the inheritance in CSS. Nothing in CSS is popular among your average software developer, which is why it's so nice to be surrounded by people who like their CSS today. So as I said, page styles can still get in, even though they are now prevented from getting out. And we have this sort of a situation here where if when things can go in but they can't come out, the word I would use for that is constipation. And whenever I come up with a concept like that, I put it in quotation marks and put it into Google to find out whether anyone else has said the same thing or has had the same idea, to see if I've actually had an original thought for once. And I have. It's a bad thought, but at least it's original. So yeah, when I looked that up, there were no direct results which made any sense. I actually got it suggested that I was probably meant to look for my cat has constipation. I don't own a cat, so Google was wrong there. I also discovered this website, which really confused me. It took me a long time to understand. So there is a website, or there's an organization called CSS, and they do have a page about constipation. But the organization is, if I remember this correctly, they're a Swiss medical insurance company. So there's sort of an information page about, if you have constipation, are you insured for constipation? Yeah, I don't know how it works in Switzerland. But yeah, so that was confusing, but that was one of the results that I got. So because inheritance is a thing, and you can't just stop it from happening. Well, you can, but I'll get on to that. But under normal circumstances, all you can really do is undo it once it's been done. And fortunately, we have this useful keyword, all. So if you use all, that means you're applying that to all properties. And if you use initial, it kind of undoes everything, even things that the user agent did. So that's kind of like, it's useful, but it's kind of not useful because it takes you back to a place which is probably further back than you want to be. So it does stop inheritance happening, but then you kind of want to build some of those styles back. So what I do, and it's not perfect, but the approach I usually use is all initial and then display revert, because I don't want all of my elements to become kind of primordial spans, because by default an element, unless otherwise specified, unless the element API otherwise says so, all elements display in line, and you kind of don't want that. So I would do something like this. I might revert a couple of other properties, but that's how I would go about it that way. The only way to stop elements inheriting styles from the page entirely from the first place, so instead of kind of overriding inheritance that's already happened, to stop it entirely, is logically to take the elements out of the page. And there are ways to do that. So there is a set of elements called frame, set, and frame, which were very popular, but then fell out of favor some time ago. But basically what you could do is you'd build your web page out of separate web pages. So on the left there, I might have my navigation, and on the right there, I'd have like my main content or my search results or whatever it is. And these are in frames. And as you can see, they have a source and they point to entirely different HTML pages. Now, because they're entirely different HTML pages, they can just have their own, whether it's embedded or whether it's linked, they can have entirely different styles, which will not cross over, will not inherit it from each other or anything. So you've got that encapsulation in a way that WebC, style components, CSS, Scopulation, Enterprise Max, AITM, or even things like scope or container queries wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So I highly recommend using, if modularization is your approach, I would highly recommend using frame, set, and frame. The support is really high. Well, what I will say is that it is deprecated, which is good news, because if something is deprecated, that basically means that it's kind of got like a badge of honor, which says, I'm going to remain in browsers forever. It's kind of like, if it's been around for long enough, it kind of gets the deprecated notice by default. It's kind of like getting, in England, we have a thing where when you reach 100 years old, you would get a card from the Queen to congratulate you. Not anymore because she's dead, but you used to anyway. So at this point in the talk, I decided it would be a good time to kind of tie things up. And in the original talk, what I did is I basically rounded up what I'd said already, like you kind of, the only kind of scope that really matters in CSS, as far as I'm concerned, the really important kind of scoping, the way that selectors work, it is already there, and it's been there since the beginning, despite what many people, one person seems to think. And that's kind of, appreciate that, I suppose, make the most of that. Then there are some specific rare circumstances where, yes, you might want to scope things, like I said, like encapsulated demos, where you don't want to use an iframe, that kind of stuff. But then I kind of just decided I'd explore the idea that maybe CSS itself was entirely a mistake and it shouldn't exist, because some people seem to think that. And what I came, when I sort of followed that conceit to its logical conclusion, from a UX point of view, there is this tension where, because CSS allows us to design things however we want, every time we go to a new interface, every time we go to a new website or a new web application, we have to relearn the visual language. We have to relearn what buttons look like and how they behave when you click them and things like that. Whereas if we didn't have CSS, all buttons would be as standard. And would that be such a bad thing? We wouldn't, as developers, be able to be so creative. But, in user research, no one ever really minds if you put someone in front of an interface you're testing and you hadn't styled the buttons yet, and they were just the default button styles that are provided by user agents. They're not going to complain about it. Real people who are, just using this stuff rather than have a vested interest in doing creative things with it, don't mind. They just want to get the task that they're doing done. So that was kind of the conceit I was going for. And then I was just going to leave the stage after saying that during CSS Day, which I thought would be kind of funny. But on a serious note, there is so much happening in CSS at the moment, and a lot of it's really exciting and powerful. And at scope is a great thing. I'm really glad that that's available for those times that you might need it. But the fundamentals are still the important thing, the ability to just apply style to something with a few selectors and to make good of it, to make it more readable, to make it a bit more accessible, to make it just easier to read. But even just the user agent styles are kind of fine. And I always think back to a very long time ago, I had this phone, which I'd of course smashed accidentally. And it wasn't an iPhone, it was like an old HTC or something like that. It was like a very basic smartphone. And I remember reading an article on it, and the CSS hadn't loaded, probably because someone had decided that for performance reasons, they were loading the CSS via JavaScript. And they hadn't got a no script fallback or something. Something had gone wrong. Something had been blocked. Maybe a resource had been blocked, because this happens all the time to me. Like half the internet is broken because of this. People putting their assets, their CSS or their JavaScript on a CDN. My ad blocker doesn't know the difference between someone using a CDN for putting shitty ads on the interface and using the CDN for just applying the basic CSS or JavaScript. So it will just block that CDN outright. And then my website doesn't have styles, and it doesn't have the JavaScript that needs to run in order for me to actually order some goods from the checkout or what have you. In any case, I read this article, the CSS hadn't loaded, it was all in Times New Roman. Because the user agent styles were there, it was fine. The headings were big, the text was small, it was smaller, it was readable, and also it was responsive. And this was in like 2004 or 5 probably, or something like that. Or maybe, no, it must have been a bit later if it's a smartphone. It was before responsive design as a thing, as Ethan Marcotte taught us how to do it in a more elegant way. But the point is that the text wrapped onto the screen. So it was responsive in that sense. I wasn't looking at tiny text. It was fine. I could just zoom in, it would wrap. And I was reading this through this broken phone, and it was a story about how a journalist was doing a piece about a marine wildlife center, and they had a octopus there. And it was the story of them getting to know this octopus almost like as a person, because that's how intelligent they are, and how they had this kind of friendship, but they were also kind of, they almost bantered, like the octopus would play with him if it was in a playful mood, would squirt water at him. It would do all of this, like whenever they were trying to do a presentation with the octopus, it would start playing up because it knew that they had to do this presentation. It thought it was funny to screw up their experiments. It was this very complex creature that you learned about. And then it was the story of how this, the loss that this journalist experienced when this octopus, they came back to the center to finish off their piece, and they discovered that unexpectedly this octopus had died, and they were mourning this octopus, this alien-like creature, like it was kin, like it was another human being. And I wept when I read that. And it's probably the single most affecting piece of content I've read on the internet. And I read it on a smashed phone on a web page which didn't have its CSS wasn't loaded. It didn't have any CSS. And so I guess that's a lesson about the importance of the content and how actually design should be transparent, and that as much as I love CSS, that's what it's really all about. It's about us sharing information in the way that Tim Berners-Lee, it's the reason that Tim Berners-Lee made it freely available. Anyway, that is me finished. That's my talk, slightly different from what I gave on CSS then. Thank you very much for listening.